Old Gerald Marsh, engaged in mending a break in the hedgerow bordering the lane, was the first to lay eyes on him, his hammer arrested mid-motion. Next, Janet Pullen of Sycamore Cottage, while walking her terrier along the track, halted at the gate, her gaze piercing the morning haze. The third observer was the boy's own uncle, who emerged from the barn, witnessed the scene unfolding, and stood with hands planted on his hips, a posture characteristic of a man rendered speechless. 14-year-old Callum Reeve was wrestling a substantial log, not a neat piece of firewood, but a lengthy, unrefined, semi-decayed section of a fallen ash tree, dragging it across the lower pasture of Birchgate Smallholding. He was intent on moving it toward a shallow excavation he had already prepared, a trench whose purpose was unclear and certainly held no place in any agricultural schedule familiar to the inhabitants of Bracken Hollow. His boots were encrusted with mud, and his jacket was damp across the shoulders. He had commenced this endeavor before 6 o'clock. "What on earth is going on?" Gerald Marsh murmured, addressing no one in particular. Callum offered no response. He carefully lowered the log into the trench, retrieved his spade, and began to backfill it with the dense, dark earth. The action resembled a burial. In a sense, it was. He interred 3 more such sections that week, followed by a 4th. The neighbors observed these proceedings. By Thursday, news had circulated to the village shop. The following weekend, his uncle had twice requested an explanation, and twice Callum had responded, "I'll show you the outcome. You'll witness it before I can articulate it." No one harbored any belief in his words. The general expectation was one of expended energy, a futile effort on a small holding already struggling to sustain itself. What remained unknown to them, not to Gerald Marsh, not to his uncle, nor to the representative from the Agricultural Society who paused at the gate 2 weeks later with a shake of her head, was that the subsequent summer would usher in the most prolonged period of drought experienced in living memory in this region of the Yorkshire Dales. And on the solitary parcel of farmland that steadfastly remained vibrant amidst the parched valley, the name adorning the gate would be Reeve. However, before any inquiries commenced, before the questions arose and mirth gave way to silence, there existed a foundational reason for Callum's initial excavation. If narratives of ordinary individuals encountering the extraordinary within the landscape resonate with you, please subscribe and become part of our community. We also invite you to share your location in the comments section. Stories of this nature possess a reach that extends far beyond any cultivated field. Callum had not grown up with aspirations of becoming a farmer. His upbringing on the small holding was akin to how most children mature within their surroundings, largely oblivious until a perceived threat of loss emerged. His mother, Ruth, had inherited Birchgate from her own father. It had never been an expansive enterprise, encompassing a few acres of grazing land, a vegetable patch, a small flock of sheep, and a resilient polytunnel that Callum's grandfather had so frequently repaired that its integrity seemed more a matter of established practice than its original material. Nevertheless, it was debt-free and belonged to them. For many years, this was sufficient. Then Ruth experienced a debilitating back injury, necessitating 2 surgical procedures and a 3rd medical consultation. Suddenly, the small holding that had functioned under her diligent care and unyielding determination required a different custodian. Callum was 14, and there was no one else available. His uncle Martin provided assistance 2 days a week. A pragmatic man, adept with machinery and concise in his explanations, he made it clear, without harshness, that he doubted a boy of Callum's age could do more than prevent further deterioration of the property. "Just keep things stable," he instructed. "Don't make the situation worse." Callum, however, did not desire mere stability. He yearned to rectify existing issues. The lower field presented the primary challenge. It had always been problematic, even during wetter periods. The soil in that particular section invariably hardened and turned a pale hue more rapidly than any other area on the holding. His grandfather had often spoken of this issue, a recurring frustration for decades. The drainage was notably inefficient. The ground rested upon a shallow stratum of compacted subsoil, and anything cultivated there seemed to lack the same vitality as the plots situated higher on the slope. His grandfather's approach had been to simply minimize reliance on that section. Callum's discovery, if such a term is even appropriate, was not an ostentatious revelation. It transpired on a Tuesday in late March as he was clearing fallen debris from a corner of the paddock where an ancient ash tree had succumbed to winter gales. He had been engaged in this task for approximately an hour, sawing and dragging timber, when he paused for a respite and observed the ground directly beneath the decaying trunk. It was distinctively different, not merely moist, but darker, softer, and possessed a richness that was visually apparent even without a precise understanding of its cause. He pressed his hand into the earth and it yielded readily. Upon withdrawing a handful, he noticed it was interwoven with delicate white roots and what appeared to be a fine, web-like structure connecting the soil particles. He excavated a little deeper with his heel. The soil retained moisture at a greater depth than would be expected, considering the weeks that had elapsed since the last rainfall. He contemplated this observation for an extended period. Subsequently, he returned to the farmhouse and located his grandfather's old notebooks within the lowest drawer of the dresser. He was searching for a fragment of recollection, a specific passage, perhaps an underlined sentence or a circled notation that the old man had never fully elaborated upon. He found it on the 47th page. It read, "Tried burying some of the old elm rounds in the top corner. Ground around the windfall always stayed different. Worth understanding why." There was no definitive conclusion, merely a statement of fact. For Callum, this observation was sufficient. He commenced by excavating a trench in the lower field, targeting the most problematic section, the very area his grandfather had, in essence, relinquished. He was not entirely certain of his methodology. He had absorbed sufficient information from his grandfather's notebooks and from a couple of library volumes he had journeyed to the neighboring town to procure to grasp that decomposing organic material performs a beneficial function beneath the surface. He understood that woody matter breaking down gradually within the soil does not simply vanish. Instead, it becomes an integral part of a prolonged process. It can influence the soil's structural integrity and nurture the organisms, the earthworms, the fungi, the microscopic networks that enable soil to function as more than a mere collection of compressed particles. He dug the trenches to a depth of 18 inches. He placed the logs with care, some split, some whole, prioritizing those that were the oldest and most decayed. He covered them with leaf mold he had gathered from beneath the hedgerow, where, he had noted, the soil was consistently the most fertile on the holding. He then added layers of grass clippings and the darker compost from the heap adjacent to the barn. Finally, he covered everything with topsoil and compacted it. He repeated this process for a second trench and then a third. He meticulously recorded his activities in a school exercise book, sketching rudimentary maps and noting the dates. He shared his undertaking with virtually no one, a fortunate circumstance, as the limited observations made by others were already stirring unease. The initial apprehension stemmed from within the household. His mother, though recuperating, was concerned. Having heard from Martin about Callum's pursuits, she inquired one evening from the kitchen doorway if this was truly the most productive use of his time. Her tone was not one of anger, but of apprehension. They had livestock to feed, a fence along the northern boundary requiring repair, and scant financial resources to accommodate errors. "If you're digging holes," she stated softly, "at least inform me what we're acquiring to fill them." Nothing, he replied. I'm utilizing what's already present. She regarded him with that particular maternal gaze reserved for children who have begun to embrace a conviction that remains beyond their comprehension. She remained silent for the rest of the evening, but her disquiet persisted. The second source of pressure originated externally. The village of Bracken Hollow was not inherently unkind, but it was the sort of close-knit community where nothing escapes notice, and observed phenomena invariably attract commentary. Word had disseminated, significantly propelled by Gerald Marsh, whose intentions were not malicious, but whose mended hedgerow provided an excellent vantage point of the lower field. By the time Callum was excavating his fourth trench, the prevailing sentiment at the village shop was that the Reeve boy was disoriented, perhaps somewhat simple, and certainly posed no threat to anyone's farming acumen. Burying wood, one individual reportedly remarked. You'd achieve more growth if you buried the boy and discarded the logs. Callum heard a second-hand account of this remark. He returned to his exercise book and continued his documentation. The third wave of pressure was more challenging to disregard due to its source, an individual whose opinion carried significant weight. Margaret Allerton served as the local representative for the Agricultural Advisory Group that provided guidance to smallholdings in the vicinity. A woman of sound judgment and considerable experience, she had assisted numerous struggling farms in finding practical solutions. She visited Birchgate in late April, ostensibly to ascertain the holding's status following Ruth's illness, and Martin seized the opportunity to apprise her of Callum's recent activities. She listened attentively. She examined the trenches. She knelt to inspect the disturbed earth. Then she straightened, brushed her hands on her trousers, and declared with genuine concern rather than disdain, "The fundamental concept isn't entirely flawed, Callum, but the timelines involved are considerable. We're discussing years for substantial decomposition. Your soil requires immediate assistance, not a distant eventual benefit. I would be reluctant to see you invest your energy in something the land cannot effectively respond to within a relevant time frame." Her assessment was not precisely incorrect. She simply lacked the land's inherent patience. By June, the lower field presented an unchanged appearance from a distance. However, upon closer inspection, in the section immediately above the first trench, a discernible difference had emerged. Callum observed this after a fortnight of dry weather, one of those periods of intense June sunshine that are brief enough not to cause alarm, yet long enough to reveal which areas of the land are faltering. Across the entirety of the lower field, the soil was beginning to form a crust and lighten in color. Yet, in the strip above where he had buried the initial layer, the ground retained a slightly darker hue. The grass maintained its verdant appearance for a few extra days compared to the surrounding vegetation, and when he carefully probed the soil at the trench's edge with a trowel, it remained crumbly beneath the surface, rather than hardened. He inadvertently unearthed an earthworm, then another. He remained seated, trowel in hand, contemplating this discovery for an extended interval. He was careful not to anticipate success prematurely. He documented the observation, dated it, and then dug to the same depth in an untreated section approximately 10 meters away. That soil emerged pale and compacted, devoid of earthworms. He walked back to the farmhouse, experiencing, for the first time, a sensation of not merely hope, but of tangible observation. However, the subsequent morning brought news that decisively overshadowed this developing sentiment. His mother's upcoming consultation had indicated the potential necessity for an additional medical procedure. The implications regarding recovery time meant that they might need to contemplate leaving the lower fields uncultivated until their circumstances stabilized. Martin cautiously broached the subject during dinner. The suggestion hung in the kitchen air like tendrils of smoke. If the lower field was to prove significant, its impact needed to be realized imminently. July proved to be a benevolent month, which, in itself, was a form of subtle cruelty. A succession of warm, humid weeks allowed the pasture to recover, the sheep to settle, and the smallholding to feel almost manageable. Ruth was experiencing gradual improvement. Martin increased his visits to 3 times a week instead of 2, and Callum's lower field, all of it now as he had completed the 5th and final trench in early June, lay quiescent and unremarkable beneath its covering of ryegrass, revealing nothing extraordinary. Martin gently suggested that perhaps the most challenging period had passed. He did not imply that Callum's experiment had been inconsequential. He simply categorized it among endeavors that had caused no harm. Margaret Allerton dispatched a brief note to inquire about their well-being. She asked about the holding's management but made no mention of the logs. Then August arrived, a month characterized by a persistent grayness and dryness, and it remained so. During the initial 2 weeks, no widespread alarm was evident. Dry Augusts were not uncommon. The stream at the base of Bracken Hollow's valley flowed at a reduced volume, but it still flowed. Farmers assessed their silage reserves, murmuring little aloud. By the 3rd week, the prevailing mood had shifted. Callum was in the lower field one evening, crouched beside the section containing the 3rd trench, when he overheard Gerald Marsh conversing with his neighbor across the hedgerow. Their exchange was not argumentative but marked by concern, the kind of dialogue where consensus prevails but offers no solace. He dug a test pit. The surface soil was dry and beginning to fracture, but at a depth of 8 inches within the dark column of earth above the buried wood, the texture remained friable, still exhibiting signs of life. It was the kind of soil that, were it to rain the following day, would absorb the moisture rather than allow it to run off. He carefully refilled the pit. He sat beside it in the fading twilight, allowing himself, for the first time, to contemplate what might lie ahead and the potential significance of the difference between this particular parcel of land and the adjacent field. It was not a miraculous solution, nor a cure, but a margin. And in the realm of farming, a margin can often be the deciding factor. September arrived without a single drop of rain. October brought 3 brief showers that merely dampened the surface. The Dales had not witnessed a drought of this magnitude since before Callum's birth, or so the elder farmers recounted, using their own generational experiences to frame every difficulty. The brook at the valley's foot dwindled to a mere ribbon. A pond in a neighboring parish completely dried up, a phenomenon unprecedented in recorded history. The pastures across the valley turned the color of straw, and farmers who had believed themselves adequately provisioned with fodder began to recalculate their needs. At Birchgate, the upper field suffered along with every other area. Callum made no pretense to the contrary. He observed the grass thinning and browning, and he meticulously rationed the sheep onto sections he had managed with particular care throughout the summer. However, the lower field exhibited a distinct difference. Not impervious, not unaffected, but demonstrably different. The pastures situated above his buried logs retained its greenness longer than the surrounding areas. This was not due to any mystical influence, but because the underlying soil was superior, healthier, and better structured. When intermittent brief rainfall occurred, it penetrated the ground rather than flowing off the hardened surface, as the soil beneath possessed the necessary structure to absorb it. The organic material, undergoing slow decomposition throughout the spring and summer, had been quietly performing its function, nourishing the organisms that enhance soil aggregation, improving the minute pores and channels through which water moves, and contributing, incrementally, to a substrate that behaves more like a sponge than a rigid surface. When Callum excavated the soil in late October, the contrast with the untreated ground was unmistakably evident. He summoned Martin to observe. Martin studied the excavation for a considerable period. "That's not insignificant," Martin remarked finally. "No," Callum concurred. The first individual to arrive at the gate was a young farmer named Priya, who managed the smallholding located 2 fields east of Birchgate. She had always been more inquisitive than dismissive. From the lane, she had noticed the lower field and perceived what others were beginning to observe. The grass within Birchgate's boundaries possessed a different hue compared to its surroundings. "I'm not seeking anything," she stated when Callum opened the gate. "I merely wish to comprehend your methods." He obliged her, explaining his process as clearly as he could, detailing the observation made beneath the fallen tree, his grandfather's notebook, and the principle of organic matter gradually improving soil over time. He was judicious in his claims, reporting only what he had observed, not what he could guarantee. She listened, nodded, and expressed her desire to implement the technique on her own land. The second visitor was Gerald Marsh. He arrived one Thursday morning, cap in hand, in a manner suggesting he had rehearsed his speech and was now uncertain of its delivery. He admitted to having observed the lower field for many months and stated that he owed Callum an apology, acknowledging that he had been among the most vocal critics at the village shop. Callum assured him there was no need for an apology, and he genuinely meant it. Subsequently, Margaret Allerton arrived. She appeared on a weekday afternoon, accompanied by her notebook, and spent an hour inspecting the lower field. She conducted several test excavations herself. She posed questions. At one point, she remained silent for an extended period, examining the dark, living soil in her gloved hand and comparing it with the pale sample obtained from the adjacent, untreated ground. "You demonstrated patience with something I advised would not yield results in a timely manner," she eventually commented. "You were correct that it requires time," Callum responded. "I simply possessed more time than I realized." A smile touched her lips at this remark. She recorded it. By the conclusion of October, 4 holdings within the parish had requested Callum's assistance in assessing their land and offering his observations. He performed these consultations without charge, as his focus was not financial gain, but the well-being of the land. The logs remained in situ, of course, buried beneath the soil of the lower field, unseen and continuously active, continuing the process initiated in March. Gradually, molecule by molecule, they were integrating into the earth that contained them. This is how it functions, not with haste, not with dramatic effect, and certainly not through the singular action of any isolated component. The logs had enhanced the soil's structure. The leaf mold had nourished the soil's biological elements. The earthworms had facilitated the creation of pathways. The grass cover had minimized evaporation. The entire system, gently guided in a more beneficial direction, had achieved a degree of resilience that singular interventions rarely provide. Callum recalled a passage from a worn paperback he had discovered on the shelf above his grandfather's notebooks, a sentence that had profoundly impacted him. "The soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all." He had not fully grasped its meaning in March, but he understood it now. The lower field had not been fundamentally flawed. Rather, it had been managed as though it were, because the initial diagnosis had been superficial. The genuine issue lay beneath the surface, unseen and unacknowledged, a compaction and a deficiency of organic life that no one had thought to investigate, as the simpler explanation was that some land is inherently unproductive and remains so. The land was not unproductive. It had been misunderstood. On the final evening of October, Callum walked the length of the lower field as daylight began to fade. The pasture was sparse but alive. The earth beneath his boots yielded slightly, a stark contrast to its usual brittleness in previous years. Above the buried logs, late-season earthworms were still actively working through the dark, interconnected soil. The drought would eventually abate. It always did. However, the farm no longer depended on the rain arriving precisely when all other resources were exhausted. That was the fundamental difference. Not a miraculous occurrence, nor the product of a single boy's conjuring trick. It was simply the enduring, patient, and quiet endeavor of restoring to the land something it had always required, and then granting it sufficient time to respond. If you have reached this point, please subscribe and join our community. We encourage you to share this content with individuals who still believe that exemplary farming is solely concerned with what flourishes above ground.